There is one thing I can do to gain some control, some kind of order. I'll have to be careful, but it's time to stop sitting on the sidelines. They don't need to know. I want to help. There's no point in sitting idly and hoping someone else can fix the situation. Even if they could, I need to make the most of it. And that starts with research. Time for an old friend to come out and play. They weren't here because they knew I was Vidar, so that means I can use that to my advantage. Time to start digging, Gavin thought as he sat down at his computer. It was like riding a bike. He got into his old coding and started reworking it, making it fit the modern designs for sites, and after a bit, he was in. He was surfing silently through the government's data servers. He had goals in mind that he hadn't had before. First off, who was in charge? NSA and CIA. So, the directors for those. He would need as much information on them as possible. And Alex and Charles. He trusted them for the most part, but both had made a strong point that he knew nothing about either of them. And yet, he had to trust them with his life. What was it his dad used to say? Trust but verify? Yeah, verify. He was going to make sure he wasn't flying blind anymore. The more he pulled up, the more he felt sick to his stomach. The things that they had to do to make sure that he was safe, even before he had the Nova system. It was sad and terrifying. And some of these didn't make sense. Alex's missions didn't always seem to work in favor of the American government. Definitely not for the American people. Charles's was fairly straightforward once you unredacted his file. 6 foot 3 inches, 275 pounds, black hair, black eyes. He knew he was big. American Indian, military operations mostly. His real name is Mato Akofli. Likely some things he didn't even know, but all seemed to be on the up and up. Alex's read different. 5 foot 8 inches, 175 pounds, brunette, blue eyes. But even when unredacted, there were chunks missing that shouldn't be. There are gaps in her training that didn't make sense, and the age she was recruited. There wasn't much on her early life, not like Charles. Fragments, names, not one, many. It didn't make sense. He would need to take a much deeper dive into her training and recruitment. Those didn't sit right with him. Gavin noticed a difference in himself as he read. It felt similar to when he was younger. Easy to read things and recall them. He didn't feel a need to write everything down because he knew it would never leave his mind. General Catherine Richmond, director of the NSA, is an imposing yet diminutive woman at 5 foot even, and mostly gray with some red hair and piercing steel blue eyes. Her record more than spoke for itself. An old soldier turned Cold War spy turned general. She was tough as nails. Her file was full of mission after mission, success after success. Rarely ever was there a failure, and the few that were there stood out as beyond her control. For a while, a couple of names, Hell and Koyas, popped up a lot, but then they stopped showing up in the late 80s and early 90s. Same with director Richard Ethan Hunter, 5 foot 11 inches, salt and pepper, black hair, and gray eyes. But his file had far less successful missions. In fact, he seemed to be mediocre before those same names as in Richmond's file showed up in his file. He had made his way to the CIA and was an apprentice to the then director. Little more than an errand boy. And then these names showed in his file, and suddenly he started his rise in power. Quickly to assistant director, and then froze until his predecessor retired. Maybe it was out of respect, Gavin thought, though in the same thought disregarded it. The freeze and the rise to power started as those names stopped appearing in his file. First one, then several years later, the other. Just gone. Gavin trudged into his room, tossing his bag on his bed, flopping down in his computer chair, and running his hands through his hair. He felt lost. I get why we couldn't break up, but she has to know how hard this is for me. She has to know how I feel about her. Everyone says it's written on my face every time I see her. And then his head sank into his hands as though it had just become too heavy for his neck. But they say the same thing about her, and that's clearly wrong. After a few minutes, Gavin finally collected enough and booted up his computer. He was thankful for the distraction from his thoughts and feelings about Alex. He was entering the password and turning on the loop he made. He scrolled down, and it was finished. Project Ogma. The file had been decrypted, and Gavin was surprisingly nervous to open it. He's never been a confident guy unless he was hacking, but this had ties to his past heavily. This got him kicked out of the Georgia Institute of Technology. This caused him to spiral into inaction and complacency for 5 years emotionally. It derailed his life. It made him lose a friend. And now, he might be able to figure out why. He clicked on the file and scrolled through the subfiles and document titles. He could tell from the listed names this project was the Nova system. In this folder was all the information on it he needed. He saw how it works, what it was meant to do, what it could do. Digging into it deeper, he found the history of it. And there again, Koyas. He was the creator of the Nova system. So that explained, at least in part, why he was so tied to Hunter and Richmond. Testing started in 1989 for humans, but the first successful test was listed in 1990. Gavin felt something about that was familiar, though he couldn't quite say what it was. He started pulling up the diagnostic charts and data, comparing them with what he had learned in Fleming's class, and what he had begun learning from Megan's neuroscience books. He had started understanding more of how it worked in his mind. And even more, he was understanding how to alter it. While he wasn't sure if he could remove the program from his head, he did know that he would be able to add or remove aspects of it, alter its programming, and adjust it to fit his mind and body better. He was getting excited. He knew he would have to keep this hidden, but being able to change what was in his head allowed him some semblance of control again. And then he remembered the other files, the other projects. Pulling out a flash drive, he brought up the other project files. Again, it was lists of recruits with their interviews and information. There were hundreds of names. The Ogma Project recruits file was small and only a handful of names. But this one had their schools listed as well. They didn't all go to Georgia Institute of Technology. This was the complete recruitment list. He started scrolling through the names. Gavin froze. He could barely breathe. He reread the name again and again. There, listed among the other recruits, Agent Alex Johnson. Gavin clicked on her file, which had everything he expected. No list of her birth name. But the name was Stacy Moore and her alias in high school. He had seen all of this from what the Nova system had on her and what he had dug up. It wasn't anything new, so he hopped over to the other lists, and she was in every one. In fact, the only list she wasn't in was Project Ogma. What are these projects if Ogma is for the Nova system download? Vidar started salivating. He closed out the files and brought up a browser. Time to dig. Within minutes, he was into the secure government servers. He started searching for anything he could find on Project Tyr, Project Ara, and Project Spartan, copying them to his external hard drive. Of course, he would have to run his decryption software over it before he could look into it more, but he was ecstatic at what he had found. Another idea came to him, and he started reviewing the files and looking into any of the agents listed. Many of them were no longer in the service, and most were dead. Everyone listed in the Ogma project didn't survive past the first 2 stages, and after seeing the files on its programming, he could see why. They were literally frying their brains with electricity. After looking through the Yogma files and seeing all the data, Gavin felt confident enough to start the programming to alter the Nova system. And, to his excitement, according to his research, he might be able to add skills. He would have to be careful, which always meant it would take time. But it would be worth it to no longer be helpless, to be able to defend himself, even if just slightly. Looking at the clock, he realized he had been working on this for several hours, and his loop would end soon. So, he saved everything off and closed it out. He was setting the loop to end with him walking to his bed, and he got up and laid down. Through the computer, someone was watching him again. "Nicely done, Gavin. You're making far more progress than I expected. Maybe we will be able to take them all down, just as they deserve," they murmured as they watched, sitting in a train station and watching two agents make a handoff. As soon as the agents parted, they took off after one. They needed to catch the agent. Everything depended on it.